So hi everyone, welcome remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Philip Blue, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. So today's webinar is titled Response of Big Sagebrush Plant Communities to Climate Change, Grazing, and Cheatgrass Throughout the 21st Century. And we are excited to have Kyle Palmquist with us today. And so without further ado, we have Laura Thompson to introduce our presenters.
Hello, NCASC is very happy to have Dr. Kyle Palmquist as the speaker today. Dr. Palmquist is an assistant professor of plant ecology at Marshall University and is also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Wyoming. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental change on plant communities, particularly as it relates to the role of climate, drought, and fire on plant community assembly over large spatial scales, with the ultimate goal of informing landscape conservation. Thanks so much, Dr. Palmquist, for giving this seminar today.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. All right, so thanks to you all for being here. We're really excited to share some of our recent work examining the response of big sagebrush plant communities to climate change, grazing, and cheatgrass-wildfire feedbacks throughout the 21st century. And I'd like to start by acknowledging collaborators on this work: John Bradford, Bill Lauenroth, Daniel Schleipfer, Rachel Rene, Maggie England, and Kevin Doherty, some of whom are here today. So today we're going to be talking about big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata ecosystems. These ecosystems are defined by low soil water availability and highly variable climatic regimes. And one of the key limiting resources for plant growth is soil water. These ecosystems are extremely common and widespread throughout the Western United States. So this map by collaborator Daniel Schleipfer shows the spatial extent of these ecosystems in green, with areas in darker green indicating more pixels dominated by big sagebrush. Big sagebrush has a pretty unique life history in that it's a long-lived shrub. It can live up to 150 years. However, it regenerates solely from seed. So that's a challenge because recovery of big sagebrush after disturbance can be quite slow because of the episodic nature of sagebrush recruitment due to very specific temperature and moisture conditions that are required. These ecosystems are home to many species of conservation concern, including the greater sage-grouse, which has been being considered for listing on the Endangered Species Act. And our work is highly motivated by the greater sage-grouse, with the hopes that we can provide some perspective on how key components of greater sage-grouse habitat will be changing in the future in response to climate and in response to disturbance. These ecosystems are undergoing transformative ecological change. Livestock grazing is a widespread and important land use throughout the region, but despite that, it can result in significant plant community change under heavy grazing regimes. In addition, these ecosystems are experiencing increases in drought severity and frequency, and in extreme cases, this can result in sagebrush mortality, which you can see in this photo here on the right. And finally, some regions within the big sagebrush region are being invaded by cheatgrass, an invasive annual grass that has large impacts on the native plant community because it changes fire activity. And in particular, it increases fire frequency, which can result in essentially state transitions from shrub-dominated ecosystems like you see on the left here in this photo to annual grass-dominated systems on the right. So two major challenges we face as sagebrush ecologists and sagebrush managers are to understand how these ecosystems will respond to interacting sources of environmental change. And second, to make management decisions now to conserve these ecosystems in a future that is uncertain. And so our group has been trying to address these two challenges by identifying how climate change and altered disturbance, such as fire, will interact to influence sagebrush plant communities in the future. And second, to provide range-wide expectations for multiple climate scenarios in the hopes that we can guide how conservation resources and conservation investment will be prioritized on the landscape. And our goal here is to identify areas that we believe will be relatively stable and continue to be suitable for species of concern like the greater sage-grouse. So in today's webinar, I'm going to talk about two parts of our research. First, examining the climate change alone impacts on range-wide big sagebrush plant communities. And this is where I'm going to spend most of my time today. And then at the end of the webinar, I will switch gears and fold in additional complexity to examine how grazing and cheatgrass-wildfire feedbacks will interact to influence sagebrush plant communities under future climate. So let's start with the first part of the talk, climate change impacts. So sagebrush ecosystems are expected to be affected by climate change because they are already water-limited systems. And they're expected to be vulnerable to climate change when they are pushed beyond their historical range of variability, when they experience conditions they have not experienced in the recent past. A nice example that demonstrates this vulnerability is episodic mortality of big sagebrush to extreme events such as hot drought. These are images from a big sagebrush die-off in southwestern Wyoming, and our group, led by Rachel Rennie, investigated this die-off. This die-off occurred in 2014, and it followed a hot drought in 2012 and some extreme precipitation events in 2013. And what Rachel discovered was the highest mortality in these landscapes, such as the mortality you're seeing in these photos, occurred in sites that over the long term had chronically dry soils in deep layers. And so this suggests this unprecedented hot drought in 2012 pushed these stress systems past a threshold. We don't expect climate change to have the same impacts everywhere, and climate change effects will be contingent on underlying environmental conditions. So this map is showing our study area of interest in gray and the sites that I'm going to talk about today as black points. And what you can see is that they span a big geographic extent in the Western U.S., and they span existing climate, elevation, and topography gradients. And so our group has been very interested to understand how sites might be responding to climate change based on their underlying environmental conditions. And for instance, how might moist, cool sites at higher elevation respond differently to climate change relative to warm, dry sites at lower latitudes and at lower elevations. And so for this part of the talk, we are exploring three main research questions. The first, how will climate change alter biomass and composition of the key plant functional types in these ecosystems, which I'll talk about in just a second? Will some geographic locations and environmental settings be relatively unaffected by climate change while others experience larger effects? And finally, is there consistency in climate change impacts among a representative set of climate scenarios? Do we see agreement among different climate scenarios in how climate change is affecting plant communities? So we explored these questions using StepWatt2, which is a plant simulation model. It simulates multiple plant functional types and species on 1 meter squared patches on an annual basis. And in the model, plants are responding to the key limiting resource in these systems, soil water. Soil water availability is simulated using SoilWatt2, which is a process-based soil water model. And so it's a coupled simulation modeling framework. Here on the left, you can see the water model, SoilWatt2, and on the right, STEP, the plant model. And so every year, we use daily weather, soil properties for multiple soil layers, and several important vegetation parameters, including biomass and root depth, to run SoilWatt2. The key variable coming out of the water model that we focus on is plant available soil water. That is passed into the STEP side and serves as resource availability that year. Plants then respond to those soil water resources by establishing, growing, and dying. And this is also a function of their life history traits, which is dictated by the species and functional type to which they belong. Thereafter, we can implement grazing and fire if desired. And finally, at the end of the year, we tabulate end-of-year biomass values for each plant functional type, and we pass that back into SoilWatt2 to serve as inputs for the next year. And so you can see it's a fully coupled approach where both SoilWatt2 and STEP are passing information to one another. The outputs from the model on the soil water model side include water balance fluxes and pools on a daily basis. And so how much water is stored and how much water is moving through the ecosystem and how. And on the plant side, functional group and species biomass, density, and also mortality. And so using this model, we can force the model with either current or future daily weather, understand how that will influence soil water, and then ultimately how those effects will influence the plant community. So we applied this model to 200 big sagebrush sites, and here is a map of those sites throughout the Western U.S. And we chose these sites very strategically to represent the current spatial extent of these ecosystems, but also to represent the range of current climatic conditions. And so this figure here on the right is showing current mean annual precipitation versus current mean annual temperature on the Y. Our 200 sites are again shown here in black, and the backdrop here is essentially the climate space of all of the pixels that are shown in gray on the left map. And so you can see that the sites we selected do a pretty good job at representing the full climate space of our study area on the left-hand side here. And this includes sites that are currently cool and moist and sites that are warm and dry. So for each of the 200 sites, we ran simulations, and I'm going to walk you through our simulation design here. So we simulated the plant community under 3 time periods: current conditions, mid-century conditions, and end-of-century conditions. For the future climate conditions, we drove the model using temperature and precipitation from 13 different general circulation models. So these are different climate models for 2 different representative concentration pathways. Now, RCPs reflect differences in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and RCP 8.5 is a more severe scenario, which would result in greater greenhouse gas concentrations and greater warming, while RCP 4.5 is less severe. So in total, we simulated each site under current conditions and 52 future climate scenarios. And today what I'm going to focus on is mean plant functional type biomass for each of the 200 sites for results for the median GCM, to give you a sense of the central tendency among the climate models we examined. And specifically, I'm going to focus on results for sagebrush, C3 perennial grasses, C4 perennial grasses, and perennial forbs. These are the most important plant functional types in sagebrush ecosystems and are quite important for greater sage-grouse. I'm also going to show you a little bit of information on agreement. And how this will be presented is the percentage of sites out of the 200 that had high agreement among climate models on the direction of change of the median, where high agreement is indicated by 10 or more of the 13 GCMs agreeing on the direction of change. And so these first set of results that I'm going to focus on were all simulated under no fire and light grazing. And so really how we're thinking about these results is potential future biomass under climate change with disturbance minimized, sort of a best case scenario. And then in the second part of my talk, I'm going to fold in grazing and fire and examine the impacts in a future climate. So where I'd like to start is by summarizing the mean changes in biomass for those major plant functional types from current to future conditions. And these results are going to summarize how biomass is changing across sites. So let's start with looking at big sagebrush. So what we're looking at in these box plots is change in biomass in grams per meter squared from current conditions to future conditions, where M indicates mid-century, E indicates end of century. And here you can see two small panels, one for RCP 4.5 and one for RCP 8.5, the more severe climate scenario. And so the box plot represents the range of changes in biomass across the 200 sites. Here, the solid horizontal line indicates the median site response. The box indicates the first and third quartile. The whiskers indicate the range across sites, excluding outliers, and outliers here are indicated with a little X. So I want to start by looking at RCP 4.5 results. So what you can see is that we simulated slight median increases in big sagebrush biomass for both mid and end of century. However, you'll also notice that some sites have moderate increases in big sagebrush biomass, while other sites have moderate decreases in big sagebrush biomass. So sites seem to be responding very differently here, which I'll get to in just a little, come back to in a little bit. I'm also going to, throughout these figures, provide a little bit of perspective on what the magnitude of these absolute changes represent. So here along the bottom in text, I'm going to show you the percent change values for the medians that are shown here. Again, those black horizontal lines. And then in parentheses, this is the range of percent change values across sites. So for mid-century, the median is about a 6% increase in sagebrush biomass. That increase is a little bit smaller under end-of-century conditions. But again, you can see here that there are moderate increases and decreases in big sagebrush biomass across sites. So the other thing I want to show is a little bit of info on agreement. So under RCP 4.5, mid-century conditions, 56% of sites had high agreement that big sagebrush biomass would increase in the future. And you can see that that agreement declined a little bit by end of century. So under RCP 8.5, the more severe scenario, we still see by mid-century slight increases in projected big sagebrush biomass, but again, a range of responses across sites. By end of century, more sites have declines in big sagebrush biomass projected, and that's indicated by a small percent change for the median here. You can also see that agreement declines under RCP 8.5 end of century conditions. So I'm going to walk you through those same box plots for the other important plant functional types. So in light green here are C3 perennial grasses, in gray are C4 perennial grasses, in blue are perennial forbs, and then in yellow, annual C3 grasses or cheatgrass. So I'm going to start looking at perennial C3 grasses here. So in contrast to big sagebrush, you can see that we projected declines in C3 perennial grasses across most sites, as indicated here by the medians. You can see also that those declines are a little bit larger by end of century, especially under RCP 8.5. However, we did project increases in C3 perennial grass biomass in a handful of sites, although those increases were small. And so from here on out, I'm just going to provide some percent change values and agreement values for RCP 8.5. So here are the percent change values for the median and for all sites as well. And one thing I want to draw your attention to, under RCP 4.5 end of century conditions, and for both end and mid-century under RCP 8.5, in a handful of sites, we simulated complete loss of C3 perennial grasses, which you can see down here towards the bottom as little X's. And in general, we simulated relatively small increases in a handful of sites. Another thing to note here is the agreement for C3 perennial grass changes was considerably higher than for big sagebrush. So by end of century under RCP 8.5, 88% of sites had agreement that C3 perennial grass biomass was projected to decline. Interestingly, C4 perennial grasses responded very differently to climate change. And you can see here almost across the board that most sites, we simulated increases in C4 perennial grasses. And just a handful of sites had essentially no change in C4 perennial grasses. Again, you can see here that those changes amplify a bit by end of century, especially under RCP 8.5. And some of these increases are quite large. So up to 100% increases in some sites. The median was a 66% increase. And C4 perennial grasses exhibited the highest agreement. So very high agreement among climate models that most sites will have increases in C4 perennial grasses in the future. Now, moving on to perennial forbs. Perennial forbs had very similar responses to C3 perennial grasses. Most sites had slight to moderate declines in perennial forbs in the future, and those declines amplified a bit by end of century, especially under RCP 8.5, with declines of up to 25% biomass simulated. And again, much higher agreement here than we simulated for big sagebrush. Finally, I'm going to end with some results here for cheatgrass. So what you can see here is that for all future scenarios, we projected small declines for the median site for cheatgrass, with some sites having more moderate declines. But I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we simulated some very large increases in cheatgrass biomass in some sites, up to well over 100% increases in some sites. And I'm going to come back to these sites later in the talk. And again, fairly high agreement on the direction of these changes. So now what I'd like to do is put some of those results in geographic context and explore our second question. Where are these sites, for instance, for big sagebrush that might be projected to have increases in biomass? Where are the sites that are projected to have decreases? And so our group has been developing an approach to take multivariate results like this for individual points and interpolate them to create high-resolution, fine-scale maps. And our justification and motivation for doing this is that these sorts of fine-scale contiguous maps can be more directly usable by land managers and resource managers, and they're especially important in topographically heterogeneous regions. And so what I'm going to do now is show you some contiguous maps that result from our interpolation method that were based on the output from the 200 sites. And we'd be happy to talk more about those methods if you're interested during the Q&A. So I'm going to start with maps for big sagebrush. And so I'm going to show you maps for current simulated big sagebrush biomass. That's what we're looking at here. And then changes in potential big sagebrush biomass from current to future conditions. So this map is again showing current simulated sagebrush biomass where darker greens indicate areas of higher biomass. The next two maps show changes in sagebrush biomass from current to mid-century in the center panel and then end of century on the far right. And these are absolute changes in grams per meter squared. And here the color scheme reflects the percent change values, essentially the magnitude of percent change. So if some sites were losing 50% or more of biomass, we would see red throughout the map, and we don't. So again, the changes here, both increases and decreases, are slight to moderate. So I want to draw your attention first to the center map for mid-century. So if you look carefully, you'll see that by mid-century, most of the increases, which are shown in blue in this map, are concentrated in the eastern half of the study area. By mid-century, the larger areas of declines are concentrated in the Snake River Plain and in the Great Basin. So again, there's more contiguous area of sagebrush decline and also larger declines in biomass here. By end of century, declines become more widespread in the eastern half of the study area. So there's less blue here on the map. And so we can see, these sort of divergent responses of big sagebrush to climate change in the future, where areas in the east that are currently cooler and moister have increases or stability in big sagebrush biomass, and areas that are currently warmer and drier in the southwest and the Great Basin have modest declines in big sagebrush in the future. So now I want to show a similar set of maps for the other dominant functional type in these ecosystems, C3 perennial grasses. So again, the map on the left is showing simulated current C3 perennial grass biomass. Darker greens indicate higher biomass. And the two additional maps are showing change from current to mid-century conditions and then current to end of century conditions. So again, by looking at these maps, you can see that more areas throughout the study area have declines in C3 perennial grasses than we were seeing for sagebrush. I want to draw your attention to the center map here. And what you can see is that most of the places that do have slight increases in C3 perennial grass biomass that we simulated are concentrated again in the eastern half of the study area. But also you see some areas here in dark red where we simulated large declines in C3 perennial grass biomass, essentially loss of C3 perennial grass biomasses in those areas. By end of century, decreases become more widespread, and the largest decreases in C3 perennial grass biomass that we simulated were in the Bighorn and Wind River basins in Wyoming, so at the top of this circle, in places throughout the Colorado Plateau, and then in the extreme southeast corner in north central New Mexico. And these changes and these declines in C3 perennial grass biomass, we believe, are being driven by a reduction in soil moisture under future conditions, especially in upper soil layers during the transition from the wet winter season to the summer dry season. So a drying of soils during the spring to summer transition. So key conclusions and results from this section of the talk. I showed you that sagebrush responded in divergent ways to climate change in wet, cool sites versus warm, dry sites, with the largest declines in already dry, warm sites. We documented this interesting result of declines in C3 perennial grasses, but increases in C4 perennial grasses. So this suggests a shift in relative importance of perennial grasses. And we believe that this will have potentially important implications for wildlife species. So for example, migratory ungulates depend on the green up of C3 perennial grasses as they migrate from their overwintering grounds to their summer grounds. And so shifts in the abundance and availability of C3 perennial grasses could have implications for their survival on their migration routes. We also believe that this could have important implications for livestock management and potentially result in shifts in forage quality for livestock. And however, some large areas, primarily in the east, were projected to be relatively stable in the future. So, we simulated increases in big sagebrush biomass in some of those locations and stability for some of the other plant functional types. So this is actually really good news. And we think that these sorts of range-wide results can actually help prioritize resources in areas that we think will remain relatively stable in the future. And so while these range-wide results can be quite useful for large-scale conservation planning, our approach and our results can also be applicable on smaller scales. And so we can extract results for smaller regions or landscapes of conservation or management interest. So I want to demonstrate how we would go about doing that for two different landscapes. And so the first landscape that I'm going to show you some results for is the Lander BLM field office in Wyoming. That is denoted here with the brown square. So this field office is to the east of the Wind Rivers. So I'm going to show you some results for that field office. And then I'm also going to show you some results for the Elko BLM district. And we chose these two areas because they occur in different parts of the big sagebrush region. They have different climates, but they also represent important core area for the greater sage grouse. So they're of high conservation concern. So the first landscape that I want to zoom in on here is the Lander BLM field office. So what we're looking at are 4 maps for that field office showing changes in functional type biomass for sagebrush, C3 perennial grasses here, C4 perennial grasses on the lower left, and then perennial forbs on the lower right. And so again, the color scheme here, increases in biomass are indicated in blue, declines in biomass are indicated in red. And so for the Lander field office, you can see that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in how plant functional types will be responding to future climate. And I should say that these results are for mid-century. Also shown here is the greater sage grouse core area as the striped overlay. And so, you can see that, especially for C3 perennial grasses, there's an area where we projected large declines. And so this area includes part of the Wind River Reservation and also BLM lands further to the east. That same area is projected to have moderate declines in both sagebrush and perennial forbs. However, areas to the northwest of the Wind River Reservation, you can see most plant functional types are projected to increase in the future. Again, so within these small landscapes, we can identify perhaps areas to prioritize conservation resources. For the Elko BLM district, these are the same 4 maps for that district, again showing sagebrush, C3 perennial grass, C4 perennial grass, and perennial forbs. And you can see for perennial grasses and sagebrush, there tends to be a bit more orange on these maps, suggesting more consistent declines, moderate declines throughout the district. However, yet again, we see heterogeneity in how plant communities are responding. And again, we think that these sorts of maps can provide opportunities to prioritize conservation resources at small scales in locations we think will be stable or more suitable for sagebrush plant communities in the future. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just finish with a few results that add some additional complexity. At this point, we've just been considering, how will plant communities respond to climate change? So now what I'd like to do is show some results for how grazing might alter those outcomes under a future climate. and then a few results for how cheatgrass-wildfire feedbacks also will impact the plant community under a future climate. So I'm going to start with a few results for grazing. And so essentially, we ran simulations for these same 200 sites under all of the same climate scenarios that I told you about, but we ran them under different potential grazing management scenarios. And so we're really thinking of these as management scenarios that someone could actually enact on the landscape. And so what this table is showing you is for each of the key plant functional types, the 3 different grazing regimes that we implemented, and the values correspond to how much biomass is removed on an annual basis. And the biomass specifically is referring to how much growth that year is removed by grazing. And so the way we represent grazing here, it's relatively simple, but it does allow us to explore different potential scenarios and essentially assess how different management strategies might impact the plant community. And so what you can see here is that moderate and heavy grazing, essentially more biomass is removed for all plant functional types, but especially for perennial grasses, perennial forbs, and annual forbs and annual grasses. So what I'd like to do is just show you a few results for perennial C3 grasses and sagebrush. So how is biomass responding to grazing under both current and future conditions, specifically RCP 8.5? And so let's start with C3 perennial grasses. What we're looking at here is biomass in grams per meter squared for current conditions, which is denoted with the C, and future conditions by mid-century, which is denoted with the M, and then end of century denoted with the E, for light, moderate, and heavy grazing. The yellow line here represents sort of a reference point. This is the median biomass across our sites under current conditions and no grazing. And so what I'd like to draw your attention to is, if one shifted from light to heavy grazing under future climate, that would result in a significant reduction in C3 perennial grass biomass, especially by end of century. And if you look here at moderate grazing, even under moderate grazing under a future climate, especially again by end of century, the median value here is quite a bit lower than the reference current conditions and no grazing, suggesting that even moderate grazing under a future climate could result in large reductions in C3 perennial grasses. Now, in contrast, sagebrush was essentially unaffected by grazing management regime. So you can see that here because all of the medians are very close together and they do not diverge from the reference here. Again, the yellow line, current conditions and no grazing. And so the effects of moderate or heavy grazing under a future climate are going to potentially shift the relative importance of shrubs and the herbaceous plant functional types. Under heavy grazing or moderate grazing, we'll see a higher proportion of the plant community constituted by shrubs relative to herbaceous plant functional types. Okay, so now I'd like to just sort of end with providing a few results on how cheatgrass may influence the plant community under a future climate. And so the goal of this work is to quantify the vulnerability of big sagebrush plant communities to cheatgrass fire feedbacks. And so this map by Brummer and colleagues is showing current modeled cheatgrass abundance, where darker areas are higher cheatgrass abundance. And so what this map indicates is that there are large areas in the western half of the big sagebrush region that are heavily invaded by cheatgrass. And while cheatgrass is present throughout the east, most big sagebrush stands in the east are not heavily invaded. However, we do not expect this very distinct geographic pattern to be maintained in the future. Warming may increase the suitability of higher elevation, cool, moist sites and high latitude sites for cheatgrass invasion. And so we are interested in exploring what climate change will mean for cheatgrass's ability to invade. And so what is the potential for the spread of the cheatgrass fire cycle into currently unimpacted areas that you can see here in the east? And again, which areas will be affected and which areas will remain resistant to cheatgrass invasion? And so to address this, again, we ran simulations for the 200 sites under all future scenarios. And in our model, we incorporated a positive feedback loop between cheatgrass abundance and wildfire. And so we keep track of how much cheatgrass is established. As cheatgrass abundance increases, the probability of wildfire also increases. So the simulation results I'm going to show you here in the next slide are under future climate with the cheatgrass-wildfire loop enabled in our model. And so I'm going to focus on results for RCP 8.5, again, the more severe climate scenario. And so under a future climate, we simulated invasion by cheatgrass in 7 of our 200 sites due to changing climate. And what I'd like to do now is go back to that format of maps I showed you previously and show you some results for cheatgrass biomass. So on the far left here is current simulated cheatgrass biomass. Again, darker greens indicate areas of higher biomass, and then changes in cheatgrass biomass by mid and end of century. And so you can see for mid-century that areas that already are dominate or have high amounts of cheatgrass biomass, we projected small declines in cheatgrass in the future. However, this will still, because these declines are small, these areas will still continue to have a fair amount of cheatgrass present. However, if you look in the east, you see areas of light blue and also some areas of very dark blue. And these are places where we simulated increases in cheatgrass biomass in the future. And so quite a few areas throughout the east, but also parts of the western half of the study area as well. And so the question then is, what will these changes in cheatgrass biomass mean for fire regimes? And then what will the impacts be for the plant community? And so I want to present a little bit of information on how changing cheatgrass biomass influences fire in our model. And so for sites where we simulate low cheatgrass biomass, the average fire return interval is 194 years. Now, under just moderate cheatgrass biomass, you can see a large reduction in the fire return interval, meaning fires are occurring quite a bit more frequently. And so the sites in blue here in the map are experiencing increases in simulated biomass, putting them in the moderate to high cheatgrass biomass categories. And so essentially we simulated pretty large increases in fire frequency in many of the sites where cheatgrass biomass increased. And the final set of results I want to show you are for what are the impacts of these feedbacks on native plant community biomass. So again, I'm showing you a set of box plots here. What these box plots show are the range of responses across the 200 sites. And these are change in biomass values in grams per meter squared. And what they represent is the difference in future biomass with the cheatgrass-wildfire feedback loop enabled relative to no fire. And so for sagebrush on the left here, you can see that all of the change in biomass values are negative. And this is for all future climate scenarios for all sites. So what this suggests is that the cheatgrass-wildfire feedback loops under a future climate are going to result, at least in our model, in consistent declines in sagebrush biomass. Now, in contrast, on the right here, you can see we simulated either no change or slight increases in perennial grass and forb biomass in response to the cheatgrass-wildfire feedback loop. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with a few remarks. Plant community responses were contingent on current climate conditions and also the magnitude of future climate change, with larger declines in big sagebrush biomass in warm, dry sites. Under climate change alone, most of the changes we documented were small to moderate in many locations. So this is really good news. However, livestock grazing and expansion of the cheatgrass-wildfire cycle are likely to magnify climate change effects, resulting in larger declines in biomass for most plant functional types. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge some other collaborators on this work and funding that has supported this work over the last several years. And love to take your questions, hear your comments. Thank you very much for your attention. And here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out to any of us for more information. We'd be happy to share some of the publications with you, talk with you more about these results and our modeling approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyle, for that presentation. Or the first question we have is from Eric Mulvar. How are you defining light grazing in terms of percent forage utilization?
Well, so going back here to our grazing scenarios, these scenarios are relatively simple and really reflect a reduction in this year's growth for different plant functional types. And these particular values, I kind of forgot to say this, were chosen based on a global meta-analysis of grazing in grasslands and shrublands from the publication shown here. And so we don't approach these grazing scenarios as, this is absolutely a light grazing regime in terms of forage utilization, but sort of thinking of them as potential scenarios where there are differences in biomass removed to understand the effects.
We have another question from Paul Stebline. What were the C3/C4 grass species native? Or were the C3/C4 grass species native?
Yeah, so we simulated Pseudoregnaria spicata for C3 perennial grasses, and Bouteloua gracilis was our representative C4 perennial grass. And for simplicity, we just represented each plant functional type by a single species. However, in this model, you can represent multiple species at the same time that represent a plant functional type.
So our next question is, again, from Eric Mulvar. He says, how did cheatgrass biomass vary in the three categories of grazing intensity under the different climate change scenarios?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And so I didn't say this, but the results I showed you, the few results I showed you for cheatgrass here were under light grazing. So we have not examined that question. We have all of these results under light, moderate, and heavy grazing. And so Maggie England is leading that effort. And that's really the next thing on her immediate to-do list, to dig into those results, to look at, yes, how grazing interacts with cheatgrass-wildfire impacts. So I don't have that answer now, but there will be more soon on this. Thanks for the question.
The next question is from Nathan Van Schmidt. So it's a clarifying question. So for the last graph illustrating the influence of fire feedbacks, was that showing change in biomass compared to other climate change projections, or change compared to present?
Yeah, great question. I kind of went through that quickly. So yeah, this is showing change in future biomass between no fire and the cheatgrass wildfire feedback loop enabled. So it's changes in future biomass. So under a future climate, these are showing that with cheatgrass wildfire interactions, there'll be a reduction in big sagebrush biomass relative to no fire.
So the next question is from Esther Stro. She asks, I believe you said your biomass model was 1 square meter. How did you reconcile that with the scale mismatch with GCM output in your results?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the strengths of our model is that we simulate competition, both inter and intra-specific competition between plant individuals, and that, of course, occurs at small scales. So that's one of the strengths of the model. The downside of the model is, yes, our pixel size or our cell size is relatively small. So we use pretty standard downscaling methods to take future climate projections and daily climate conditions for individual sites to downscale future projections from GCMs, both spatially and temporally. Yeah, it is certainly a challenge that we, with utilizing climate information that are at a larger grain size than 1 meter squared. Yeah, so again, but our ability and our attempt to be very strategic in site selection, we are choosing sites in very different climatic settings. It is a challenge we face because we are using inputs to our model from GCMs that are at a larger spatial grain than 1 meter squared. But we downscale using standard methods. We downscale those projections so that they're on a, we downscale them both temporally and spatially so that they're on a smaller spatial scale.
Great. So our next question is from Mitchell Eaton. Can you or did you apply grazing spatially, i.e. heterogeneously across the landscape, or was grazing applied uniformly?
It's a great question. Yeah, we applied grazing in a uniform fashion for each site. So each site experienced, light grazing, moderate grazing, heavy grazing. So yeah, we did not implement any spatial heterogeneity grazing within our sites. That is something we could actually do in the future, however. I didn't mention this, but we have a mode of this model that is a gridded landscape where essentially we simulate many cells that are 1 meter squared, and we could, in fact, manipulate grazing heterogeneity to explore that.
Okay. And Schmidt asked a follow-up question. And if the former, what was the overall impact on sagebrush biomass compared to present, if it was applied spatially?
Yeah, so again, we applied grazing in a uniform fashion, but the effect of that uniform grazing regime sort of shown here in this figure. And so this is the response of big sagebrush to light, moderate, and heavy grazing. And so you can see that the response of big sagebrush was relatively minimal. If you remove a small amount of annual growth from big sagebrush under heavy grazing, yeah, so the effects on big sagebrush biomass itself were pretty minimal here.
So the next question is from Will Janosek. Have you considered the differences in native grazers, e.g. bison, to traditional livestock?
No, we have not done that yet. It's something we absolutely could do, especially because, the values I'm showing here, we can really manipulate values in any way we'd like. So we could manipulate the amount of biomass removed from certain plant functional types to mimic native grazing. So yeah, we've been mainly focused on livestock grazing because of its importance in the Western U.S., but we absolutely could do something. and it would be very fun to do. Yeah, especially if we have, good information on how, which, there is good information on how different native ungulates are using these particular plant functional types or their preferences for them.
Okay, great. So our next question is from Paul Devlin. Does the vulnerability of sagebrush community to climate change exacerbated by fire/cheatgrass cycle warrant the cost of curtailing cheatgrass spread following fire?
Oh, yeah, well, that's a great question. Our results certainly indicate that with climate change alone, the perspective for sagebrush is actually pretty good. But yes, the cheatgrass-wildfire feedback loop can amplify changes. And so I'm not sure I can answer that question. I think it would sort of depend on the scenario, the site, but yeah, cheatgrass control, prevention, eradication seems to be quite important for maintaining levels of big sagebrush biomass under a future climate.
So our next question is from Aaron Johnston. What's the spatial resolution of these simulations, and what were the data sources for the starting values of biomass?
So the spatial resolution, well, the spatial grain is 1 meter squared. And essentially each of the sites I showed you was a 1 meter squared pixel where we simulate the plant community over multiple iterations. With regard to the starting point for biomass, essentially, I didn't say this, but this is a individual-based model. So we monitor plant individuals. So the model begins with no plants established. And we use minimum biomass from the literature and maximum biomass values, and then grow using logistic growth. And so they establish at their minimum biomass and then grow via logistic growth based on resource availability. And we're tracking how many individuals are established, and that's how we get to species and functional type biomass. That helps.
So this is another question from Mitchell Eaton. How might this work be used to inform the design and implementation of habitat exchange markets currently being used to manage for sage-grouse, for example?
Well, I'm not very familiar with habitat exchange markets. So could you provide just a little perspective on what those are, and maybe I could answer that?
Mitchell, feel free to follow up in the Q&A.
Sorry about that.
While we're waiting for Mitchell, we ask the next question. It's from Jessica Mitchell. Could the field data be made available for unrelated applications, such as refining statewide land cover land use mapping?
Yeah, so these simulation results, we are absolutely planning on sharing. We're creating lots of different maps, like some of the ones I've showed you here, and working towards integrating them in sort of an open data science platform where in an ideal setting, one could go and pull up different climate scenarios or time periods and different management regimes, grazing management regimes, and then look at the data. So yeah, we're working right now on generating full of these types of maps, and then we very much hoping to share them with federal agencies, other stakeholders. Yeah, stay tuned for more information on some of the products, and feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to keep you updated on when they become available.
The next question is from Laura Welp. Biological soil crust is a functional group that underlies many of the vegetation communities in question. Climate change impacts on this group may significantly affect ecosystem function. Any plans to include this group in future research scenarios?
It's a great question. We have not been including biocrusts here at all. And yeah, they are really critical for many things. We don't have any immediate plans to include them. It may be possible in the future, but yeah, we haven't been, we don't have any immediate plans to include them. It is a nice idea.
So Jessica Mitchell asked a follow-up to her question related to field data being made available for unrelated applications, like refining statewide land cover land use mapping. She's asking, and the in situ data.
Okay, yeah, so just to also clarify back to the field data question. So these results that I showed today, essentially, there was no field data per se that went into them. We use, inputs of climate, and we use published information in the literature about each of these species life history traits, and then simulate, growth of those plants. So I should be clear that there were no field data that went into the model. However, yeah, we really want these simulation results to be useful in as many settings and contexts as possible. So again, we are working towards making them more widely available. And once we get our complete set of plant community surfaces produced.
Eaton gave additional clarification for his question related to habitat exchange markets. So he said habitat exchange markets allow for significant development impacts to current habitat in exchange for support of protected or stored habitat elsewhere.
Ah, yes, I see. Yeah, and I should say more broadly that, our initial work here was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, very much centered on sagebrush habitat, trying to identify areas that would continue to be suitable in the future. So I think there's a lot of potential here to use these markets, as you have described, to focus conservation effort in areas that will be relatively stable, and also recognize that there are some areas that will be less stable, where it'll be much harder to overcome climate change effects, and perhaps those would be places where more development could occur.
Well, I again want to extend my thanks for Kyle spending the time to give us this presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for all the wonderful questions, and thank you folks for organizing this, and appreciate your questions and time.